Hello, everyone. Welcome to Class 9 of Lawfare's hacking course. I am Scott Shapiro, joined always by the amazing, talented Sean O'Brien. Say hi, Sean.
Hey, everyone.
So, as you can see, I'm not in my normal office because today we're getting real. We're gonna, I'm kind of giving you the basement hackery feel here. As I said, the course is divided into thirds. The first third being about operating systems and getting comfortable with the command line. Then the next third, the next 4 classes are about networks, and we've been talking a lot about networks. Then now the last third will be applying that information, that knowledge, to actually hack. So we're going to do some hacking today and for each class going forward. The way we're going to divide it is a big part of hacking is examining, analyzing, scanning ports. So Sean is going to walk us through how to open and close ports, and then take it to me. I'll talk about the so-called cyber kill chain, talk about the approximate phases of a hack and how to engage in port scanning. Then Sean will walk us through the installation of Metasploitable, the vulnerable virtual machine, and Metasploit, the exploit framework we'll be using. And then I'll pass it to me, and then we'll break into some machines. Sean, take us away.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. This week is sort of relatively light. We're trying to prep you for the hacking that you're going to do at the end of the class, which is coming up pretty soon. So first things first, you see my terminal here. I'm going to look up the IP address of my machine. So a reminder on how to do that. It's ifconfig for interface config. And the reason we're doing that this week is to just do a reminder and sort of a refresher on IP addresses and make sure that you know how to open up ports, do port forwarding, communicate between multiple virtual machines. We are going to be using a virtual machine called Metasploitable, which Scott sort of hinted at. It's a really cool thing because it's a really vulnerable machine, but you need to know how to talk to it. So first things first, I'm on Kali here. You can see my INET address here, 192.168.1.116. Remember, this is my local IP address, right? This is the IP address that my local router, everything on my LAN, local area network sees this machine as, okay? To the outside world, of course, I have another address, and we talked a little bit about that when we talked about DNS and so on, and when I spoofed that Facebook site, we tricked the router, right, into sending requests for Facebook.com to this local machine. To find the information for how your IP address looks to the rest of the world, right? You can go up to this little port icon here that looks sort of like an Ethernet jack. You can right click and then go connection information. And you'll see here default route or route. That's your router, okay? So that's what it looks like on your local network, your router's IP address. If you then pop that information into your browser, you usually get your router console, okay? And your router console might look a little something like this. This is a screenshot of my router console using something called DDWRT. I'll zoom in a little bit. And you'll see here that it shows the local IP address for that router as 192.168.1.1. It has some other information. It shows other hosts on the network. It shows a MAC address. Your version will be a little bit different. It might say Linksys or Netgear or Cisco or whatever, maybe your ISP provider like Comcast, something like that. But you will see an outside IP address somewhere in those settings for your internet. Okay, mine is 24.2, and then there's 2 numbers that I blanked out here. You'll also see it in this screen, which is probably a little less confusing. It'll show, hey, you know, this router, this whole network, everybody who comes to my home, joins my Wi-Fi here, my smartphone, my wife's phone, my dog had a computer, they would be on this IP address, and that's what the outside world sees. That's something called network address translation, or NAT. We talked about it a little bit before. I'm not going to go into too much depth with it here, but basically the outside world sees one address for you, and internally you have another one. But knowing the internal address at 192.168.1.114 in my example, yours might be slightly different, is really important for the hacks we're going to do, because you're going to be attacking one virtual machine from another virtual machine, and those 2 local addresses are the ones you're going to need. Okay, now let's go back to the terminal and let's do a few things that will sort of explain to us a little bit better how firewalls work, what a firewall is at a very, very basic level. So on your local machine, right, you expose certain services to the internet, right? And if you have a server, like a web server, you might expose, let's say, port 80. We did some attacks already with this. Scott will show you something a little more complicated in a little bit here. But let's just scan this machine using nmap, which we've used before. Nmap space -P 80, so port 80, then minus capital P for pretty, then a lowercase n for numeric. That just has to do with the way the information is going to be displayed. You don't necessarily need those last 2 switches, those last 2 settings. And then I put in the IP address here for another machine on my network. So 192.168.1.116. Actually, let's check here. Yeah, no, that is my machine. Okay, good. That's even better. Okay, so I'm going to hit enter here. And bam, you'll see port 80, TCP close. So the service HTTP, the default port for it, which is port 80, like if I had a web server on this machine, is closed by default on Kali. And so Kali has an internal control. It has a very basic firewall by default in the Linux kernel called IP tables. And IP tables basically says, hey, the incoming ports are closed by default, and 80 in this case happens to be one of them. But what if I want to configure that port to be open? Well, a very simple tool you can use, you can install, is called UFW, for Universal Firewall. So we're going to install that. We're going to use sudo, of course, because we're doing an administrator task. Sudo apt get, so that grabs from the internet a package. Then we do install. So we're going to install that package, and the package name is UFW. Then we hit enter. We enter our root password here, Kali, or sudo password. And you'll see a bunch of stuff happen. Basically, it downloads, configures, installs. Hopefully, it's that simple for you. It ran really quickly on my machine, which is great. I'm going to clear here just to make some room. And I'm just going to enable the firewall. So I do sudo space UFW enable. Firewall's active, it's enabled. When this virtual machine starts up, UFW will start with it. So now I can use this tool called UFW, to allow certain traffic in, to deny certain traffic, to make whitelisting, blacklisting, allow lists, deny lists, et cetera, for this machine. So let's say I wanted to make sure I had port 80 open. I could do sudo UFW allow 80. Rule added. Now if I do sudo UFW status, you'll see 80 is allowed from anywhere, because the default is just very basic rules. And also it says version 6 here. So with IPv6 as well as IPv4, I'm allowing traffic in. So now this machine is vulnerable on that port 80. And as we'll show you with Metasploitable in a little bit, and sort of in the next few weeks, and hopefully in your hacks as well, this port scanning, understanding how to open ports and so on, is really, really vital to make sure that you know what can be attacked, what's vulnerable on the machine, and of course, in your own life, how to lock down and make your machine less vulnerable. So I can go sudo, for example, UFW deny 80. And then I can check the status again, and you'll see deny from anywhere, deny from anywhere. Okay, very, very basic stuff. Yeah, I guess I'll go back to you, Scott, and then in a little bit after this, we're going to follow up, and I'll show you some more advanced stuff with routing and port forwarding.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the so-called cyber kill chain. Think of hacking as you come up to a house and you want to break into the house. And so you look at the windows, you look at the doors, maybe you look to where there's cracks in the side of the house. There's a cellar, there's a chimney. There are all these things. Think of those things as the ways that you can get into the house. And they're like your ports, right? So the ports are the ways in which you can get access to a computer that you, whose information you want to get a hold of. Now, what's the so-called cyber kill chain is a way of thinking about gathering information and intruding into an account and escalating your privileges to the point where you can get either root privileges or at least enough privileges you need to get what you want to get. So normally it starts with a reconnaissance phase. You're gathering information. You're engaged in what I'll do soon, which is called port scanning. From that, you try to figure out what vulnerabilities are in the account, try to break into those machines by exploiting a vulnerability. That's your intrusion phase, and then you try to escalate privileges. So, like if you break into a house, you may break into the broom closet or the bathroom, but what you want to get is to the bedroom or to the living room, which has the silver in it. So you want to escalate privileges. While you're doing it, you want to obfuscate your trail. You want to make sure that you're not leaving footprints, that you're being very quiet, that if there are logs, that you delete the information in those logs so they can't tell that you've been there. You keep a light footprint. You try to engage in what's called lateral movement, moving from one account to another until you get to where you want to go, and then you can maybe change the data if you want. You can exfiltrate the data, and so that data that you exfiltrate can then be input to a further cycle of intruding into other accounts and yada yada yada.
Okay, so we're going to jump the gun a little bit, but that's okay. This order works fine as well. Basically, I am going to show you, assuming I can get my screen sharing working. I'm going to show you a few tips and tricks for your router to get port forwarding, ports to open, universal plug and play, all these settings you may have heard before that you may need to make sure that your Metasploitable is attackable, basically. So this vulnerable machine that we're going to help you set up, you will probably need to configure something on your router to make sure it's attackable. Maybe not, but let's go through it. Okay, great. So this is another screenshot from my router panel. Remember, I went to that panel by finding the IP address of my router. It's usually something simple like 192.168.1.1, or it might be like .10.1 or 100. Some version of that. And of course, you can find that information again by going to your network manager and figuring out what the default route is or route is. On a Windows machine, you can use ipconfig, or you can look at the network manager there in the control panel. Similar settings in a Mac as well. You look in your networking and you can find out that information. Okay, cool. So I'm in that panel here, and I'm in a tab here that says port forwarding, and you'll see I have a machine that's mining cryptocurrency in this example that has a specific port, and then that has an IP address for the machine, and that port is open to allow this machine to talk to the outside world. Okay, so that port forwarding basically says, hey, when people request this port, 44158, from this router, you, the router, are going to send traffic to this specific machine, 192.168.1.128. If you have a web server and it were port 80, then that would be port 80, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And you can set up all kinds of services that are open to the outside world. Obviously, these days, most folks are not running a web server from their home, but you might have done something like this for gaming, for example, for your Xbox or for your PlayStation and so on. Okay, similar here, you'll see that there's something called Universal Plug and Play, and this is basically a little panel that shows those settings. The idea with UPnP is, hey, port forwarding sucks. Nobody likes doing it. Nobody understands it. Things need to just be plugged into your network, and they need to just work. So this protocol and the services behind it on your local machine basically tell the router, or try to tell the router, hey, we have a service we want to run on this specific port. Can you do me a favor? Can you open up the port and configure it correctly so that traffic goes to my machine whenever somebody from the outside world requests information that looks like X, right? Looks like, peer-to-peer traffic or web traffic, send it on this port to this machine. So universal plug and play is really useful. In this case, hopefully it doesn't look like in this panel that this was manually configured. It's supposed to just work. So when you look at your router, you may see those settings as well. The other thing to be aware of that you'll see in your router, which can be kind of confusing, I know I'm throwing a lot of acronyms at you, is DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone. This is a term that cybersecurity folks use for really any machine that's sort of vulnerable to the outside world, outside of a local network that's sort of a secure enclave of some kind. In the world of your home internet, DMZ, Demilitarized Zone, basically means all bets are off. This machine that you configure, whatever IP address you pop in here and you enable this, is just vulnerable to the outside world. The router's not going to protect it from traffic that's coming at it. Obviously, that can be very dangerous, way less dangerous when we're talking about a virtual machine that we don't care about, of course. But obviously, if you do this for like your home laptop, it's not the smartest thing in the world. This, unfortunately, the setting tends to be what tech support will tell you if you tell them your PlayStation won't go on the internet. But you might see these settings in your router, and it's a good thing to be aware of. Okay, and then just last, before we go back to Scott here, and we'll talk a little more about this when we set up Metasploitable. You'll recall from weeks 1 and 2 that there are settings in VirtualBox which sort of mirror these router settings we're talking about, right? In each virtual machine, there's a network tab here in the settings. You click the gear that says settings, you click network, and we've been advising you to use bridged adapter. Now that means that you're bridging the virtual adapter inside your virtual machine to the network card, or Wi-Fi card usually, in your host machine that's hosting the VM. Okay, so basically the networking traffic goes through your host machine, your laptop, your desktop, whatever, and then gets forwarded to the VM. It's bridged that way, right? We've also, in some cases, had you configure NAT. If for some reason that doesn't work, now you know what that means, right? So network address translation basically means that it's going to sort of punch through that layer, right? It's going to look to the router like it's its own machine, is in this example. Restrictions that your host machine has should not affect the guest virtual machine. It should just punch through that and then talk to the router by going through. And then the last thing, which can be useful, especially if you do some of the more complicated hacks, or you have like many virtual machines you want to set up, 2 or 3 of them, which we will be doing, you can set this as internal network. And that means basically you'll have your own little LAN of virtual machines, right? And those have their own IP addresses, and they talk to each other as if they were physically plugged into like another router on your network. That can be kind of confusing, but if you get to the point where either NAT or bridge adapter don't work for you, you might want to try this setting. Okay, back to you, Scott.
Okay. So this was the cyber kill chain that I mentioned: reconnaissance, intrusion, exploitation, privilege escalation, lateral movement, obfuscation, and then whatever you want to do, either denial of service or exfiltration, or changing data. Now, obviously, this is like an ideal description of a very messy process. The idea is not to get caught up at each stage, but the idea is like you want to get some data that is on some system, and you try to establish a network connection because you want to get in to that system. You want to work your way up by exploiting various kinds of vulnerabilities, so that you have enough privileges to get the data that you need. And so that's all that the cyber kill chain is trying to get at. So the first thing would be reconnaissance. So like I said, like you're casing out the network and trying to see whether a machine that you're looking for, your target, is on the network, or whether the machine that's on the network is vulnerable. And so just like you're looking at the windows and the doors, you're looking at the ports in the case of a computer system. And you will most likely begin by doing nmapping, network mapping, using nmap, which is what Sean just used and is used in previous classes.
Basically what we're doing here is, right, we have a toolkit called Metasploit that's packaged by default with Kali Linux, right? We used it actually when we did the DDoSing a few weeks ago, if you recall. We used Metasploit. MSF console was the command, and I'll show you those commands again so that you can start that up. But this Metasploitable machine is purposefully offered by the same people who make Metasploit to have a really vulnerable, really attackable machine that you would never ever want to run in real life for anything except for attacking. We sent around a link to Metasploitable via email a little bit before class, and if you go out to that link, which I will also pop into chat again here, then you will see there are two places you can grab it from to download. One of them is directly from these folks at Rapid7 who create the thing, and the other one is at sourceforge.net, which is sort of like the old GitHub. That's where a lot of folks used to package their projects. I've heard from some folks that the SourceForge link is better because it doesn't ask you for any information like email address or anything, so you may want to use that second link. Okay, when you click on that, of course, I'm not going to download it in front of you. I've downloaded it before. But when you click on that, you're going to get a zip file. Now, unlike a 7-zip file, which is what we had for Kali, we should all be able to open a zip file without any issues and extract that. So you're going to download that zip. You're going to extract the folder somewhere on your computer, and then you're going to have a folder that's called Metasploitable2. Just like with Kali, where you need to know where that is so that you can set up your virtual machine, you also need to know where this Metasploitable2 folder is so that you can set up your VM. I'm going to walk you through the steps for doing that. Okay, so this should all be familiar to you. This is a screenshot of my VirtualBox. Yours might be slightly different. And of course, we'll have to update the Git with instructions that are slightly different for these other scenarios where you can't use VirtualBox. But similar to how you set up Kali, you're gonna set this up. If you're using VMware, it should probably be even easier because this virtual machine is packaged in VMware format. Okay, so in VirtualBox, I'm going to click New here, and then it's going to pop up a window like this one. Apologies for this terrible orange highlighting. I hope no one is colorblind, because that would be very hard if you have an orange-red color blindness. But basically, it says name and operating system here, and then I popped in the name Metasploitable. You don't have to change any of these other settings. Just leave the defaults, except make sure it says Linux here and 64-bit. Okay. Then the other thing you need to change on this screen is you need to click the little toggle that says hard disk, and you need to go down to use an existing virtual hard disk file. And then you click the little folder and you browse for metasploitable.vmdk. That's a VMware file, but it can be opened on VirtualBox or VMware or other virtualization software as well. When you do that, you may get a pop-up like this, depends on your version of VirtualBox, that gives you this hard disk selector window, and then just make sure that you've actually selected Metasploitable, the VMDK. Okay, that's all good, so I would click Finish here. And I've already actually pushed these screenshots to the Git, so these should be there, but we need to write up the instructions for you. But the screenshots are there now if you need to go back through this. And then, bam, you'll see my VirtualBox, of course, has a few more virtual machines than you may have, because I play with operating systems all day long, or at least a big chunk of my day. So Metasploitable is here now, set up. I click Settings, and the screen we just showed you, again, we're trying to reinforce, make sure you go to Network and have Bridged Adapter as the default setting. That should work. If you have issues, you may want to change that to NAT. Okay, once that's done, you go back, you start the machine, very similar to how you did your Kali at first, and it will boot in a console-looking, terminal-looking setup here. Metasploitable is just a server. They call it a headless server, right? It has no graphical interface. So unlike Kali, you're just dumped into the terminal, but that's okay. We should be very used to it by now, right? You'll see login with msfadmin/msfadmin. So that's what you would enter for the username and the password by default. And then once that's done, the thing you need to know, as we just showed you, is the IP address of this machine. So pop in ifconfig. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Or you could go to your router console and it should actually show up on your router console. But either way, you're going to see inet address here for eth0, 192.168.1.114. So that is the address of the Metasploitable machine. When you attack it using Metasploit, that's the IP address that you'll be attacking.
So the first thing I want to do is, the only thing I know for right now is that my Kali machine is on my home network. And I want to check out what's going on to see if there's a vulnerable machine on my home network, and hopefully whether it's Metasploitable. So I'll nmap it. I'm gonna do preview for verbose. Let's see, get rid of this here, and I am going to do 192.168.254.0.24. So what this is doing, this is going to map my entire local network here in my apartment, and here it is spitting out all the various devices it found on my machine, on my home network, and the ports associated with those, which ones are open. One thing I can tell just as this thing is going on is that that 192.168.254.143 looks interesting. It seems like it has a lot of ports that are open. I'm going to one way you can discover how much time is left in a scan is if you just hit a key, and it'll say 85 percent. I'm going to stop it here, and I am going to assume that the machine that I'm interested in is that 192.168.254.143, these people, because it seems like it has a lot of ports open. So I'm going to nmap. I'm going to go -v -s v, and I am going. What this is going to do is this is going to scan the machine at 192.168.254.143, and see how long it has to go. A lot of hacking is just kind of just sitting around, just waiting for a scan to finish. So it looks like it's almost done. You know what? Okay, I planned for this, so I have already done the scan. So what would have happened is all this information would have been spit out in somewhat of an orderly fashion at the end of the scan. Now, one of the great things about Metasploit is that if you run nmap within Metasploit, it takes all that information and it puts it into a database that you can access. So let me go into MSF console. So to start Metasploit, you have to do a couple of preliminary commands. So sudo service PostgreSQL start, and you have to add your sudo password. Okay, and then the next thing do is msfdb space init. So what you're doing is you're initially you have to do the sudo msfdb init. Okay, so what this will do is this will initialize the databases so that when you do your port scanning, it'll put it in a nice table. Okay, so to get into Metasploit, you go MSF console, and that will take a second to spin up. Okay, so what you would do, instead of doing nmap, 192.168, yada, 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 in Metasploit, you use the db underscore nmap, and you can do 192.168.254.0/24, which is to do my whole local network. Now, I'm not going to worry about this whole scan taking place because I did this before the class so that we wouldn't have to sit here. Oh, of course, it just finished. Okay, so one thing you can do is you can type in hosts at the prompt, and that will give you a nice table. Let me stretch this a bit. Okay, clear hosts. Okay, there we go. Looks nice. Okay, so what this tells me is that I have 6 hosts on my local network. This 192.168.254.12 is my Apple TV, and these two I don't know yet, but I do know because I know the answer to this. This is my iPhone and my iPad, this is Kali, the virtual machine I'm in right now. And this is some unknown machine, which is 192.168.254.143, which is, I'm guessing, is Metasploitable. But that is the one, and Gateway, that's my router. So it's this one, this host, which I'm most interested in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do what I did before, db nmap v sv 0 192.168. By the way, people use different switches. I basically pick them at random. 143, and we're running that. And this is going to be over with very quickly, or else I can just kill it because I ran this before the class. And just like we got hosts, which listed out the hosts on the network, if I type in services, that gives me all the services on all the hosts on the network. Now, I'm actually only interested in the last host, in 192.168.254.143. So I'm going to go services 192.168.254.143. Okay, so these are the, I'm going to lower this a little bit, shrink it a little bit. These are the services and the ports that are running on this machine. And if I had let the, actually, I'm going to run it right now. I won't, because let me not screw this up. Okay, so port 21 FTP, port 22 SSH, port 23 Telnet, port 25 is open for SMTP, which is email. The port 80 HTTP, that's open, as is some other stuff going on here, SQL databases. And so what I want to do is I want to study these carefully to see if there are any vulnerabilities in these services. Now, as I'm just scanning this quickly, the thing that jumps out at me is Metasploitable root shell. Now, a shell, we've been using a shell. That's what the program that you use when you're typing things in at the command line. You're using a shell. A root shell is a shell that operates with root privileges. So if, in fact, this is really a root shell running on port 1524, wow, that would be too good to be true. So you're like, let me just, maybe this is a secret backdoor or something. Maybe I can get a root shell by just creating a network connection from my machine to Metasploitable on port 1524. Now, there are several ways of establishing a network connection, but what we're going to do is a very simple one called netcat, NC, okay? And basically it says, please make a connection to host at 192.168.254.143 at port 24. Just knock on that door, or, try to pull open the window, see if it opens. And amazingly, let me put this up there. Amazingly, I now have root in Metasploitable. This is actually not Kali anymore. This is another machine, I know it's another machine because it should have ifconfig. Right, this is the Metasplitable machine, 192.168.254.143. So I've already gotten into the Metasplitable machine just by creating a network connection using Netcat at port 1524, which I discovered through Nmap. Who am I? I'm root. You can say I'm root because of the hash prompt over there. So that's pretty amazing. That was a little too easy, so let's get out of this. And now we're back in Metasploit. We are not in Metasploitable anymore. I can show you this because we should have a different IP address. So this is 192.168.254.142. Okay, so we went back into Cali. So we were temporarily we were root in Metasploitable at 143. Now we're back in Cali 142. Okay, now let's look at the services on 143. Well, the first one I see here is FTP is FTPD 2.3.4. Now, I think Sean did this before, the VSFTP, or was it SFTP? So VS is a very secure file transfer protocol, D for Daemon. Okay, so maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a vulnerability there. Well, there are two ways to figure out if there's a vulnerability. I mean, there are many ways to figure out whether there's vulnerability, but there are two basic ways to do it. One is to type it into Google. So type in FSFTPD 2.3.4, enter, and Google's pretty good about getting that information. Metasploit has a search function as well, which is very helpful because A, you're in Metasploit. Number two is it will then tell you, hopefully, how you can exploit whatever vulnerabilities are there if it has it in its library. So what we're going to do is going to go search VSFTPD and just see if it has anything. Oh, look at that. It has an exploit for VSFTPD 2.3.4. It's a backdoor. It's excellent. Wow. Okay, that sounds really great. How do we use that exploit? Well, the first thing we do is we type use. Let me clear this so you can see it on top. So we have use exploit, and you can do tab complete. Actually, search VSFTPD. So now search. I'm sorry. Use exploit Unix FTP VSFTP backdoor. Okay. So now we have the exploit loaded. How do we use this exploit? Well, Metasploit is really helpful in that respect. So what we do is we go show options, and that tells us that what we need to do is we need to set the R host, the remote host that we want to, whose backdoor we want to open. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go set R hosts to Metasploitable, which is 192.168.254.143. Okay, so that clear. Okay, show options. Okay, so it looks like we're all locked and loaded. Now, how do we launch an exploit? Of course, with the word exploit. So we're going to see whether this works. It has found a shell. And let's see if it does. Oh, okay, it has now opened a shell session. Now, what may be confusing right now is that you don't see anything. There's no prompt. And this happens sometimes when you break into a machine in a kind of illegitimate way. Not everything will work right or work perfectly, and sometimes you won't actually get a shell. You will get a shell, you just won't know you have a shell. But you can find out that you have a shell because you don't have a prompt here. You can go, who am I? And it'll tell you root. You say, what's my present working directory? Well, in the root directory. Okay, well, let's do a ls of the root directory. Okay, now we see all these things. Let's see who the users are. Clear. Let's see who the users are. So we're going to go cat etc password. Okay, so these are the users. We're right now root. And of course, you can also then see what happens. You get kind of weird stuff. You can also get the shadow file. Since you have root privileges, you can read the shadow file. Okay, we're going to exit back to our Kali machine, and we're going to exit out of this. And what we're going to do is we're going to think about, now that we were able to get into the Metasploitable machine, what do we do there? How do we create like a base from which to hide, or to go in and out, or to just to sit and to watch, and figure out how to escalate privileges so you can get better information. Now, right now we're root, so you can't be more elevated in privilege than root. But we will talk about what happens when you're not running as root, how you should be thinking about lateral movements in the network, and how to manipulate some really cool things in Metasploit called Meterpreter, which can, turn on webcams and do keyloggers and things like that. Really some neat stuff. And that's what we're going to do next class, where we will continue hacking.
But what Scott just showed us is really like a sort of bringing everything together that we've been doing, right? We've broken into remote machines. Now we have a very vulnerable machine to break into, and we have all these exploits that are sort of pre-set up or ready for us to use. And we can use those Unixy commands that we spent weeks, making sure we get comfortable with, so that we can navigate and go through these remote file systems and wreak a little bit of havoc. So I'm pretty psyched about it.